Hello class, I know you're probably working on your final revisions for the analysis paper, which is due on Tuesday. I wanted to do this walkthrough of a student's paper so that you can see some of the things that I'm looking for in the paper. I've made a lot of comments. I'm going to post this paper in the announcements as well, so that you can get on and look directly at my comments, and hopefully those will be helpful to you as well. And I'm not going to point out every problem in the paper. I'm going to point out some that the writer of the paper needs to go through and and fix similar issues in the paper. We don't have time to go through everything, but at least get a sense of kind of what I'm looking for, and what needs to take place. Okay, and so um, just to begin with, um, up here, there's an unneeded comma here between February and 2017. When you put a date in this format, you don't need a period or a comma. You would need a comma if you had it in this format instead. So if it were in this format instead, and you deleted this, you would need a comma to separate the day and the year because they're both numbers. But the way it's written now, you don't need to do that. You don't need the comma. As we go down, and this is just getting into the paper, and so we have the analysis. Here we have the introductory paragraph that's introducing the article, the authors, giving us some information about the authors to show why we should take their claims seriously, and what their main claim is. And so here we have that information spread out through, let's see, about three sentences. And really that information needs to be compacted into one sentence. And so I've given a possibility over here, a suggestion of one way to do that. There are many ways to do that. So something like this: in a prudent path forward for genomic engineering and germline gene modification, a group of scientists led by Jennifer Doudna, a researcher at the University of California, claims, and then you would put the major claim that the scientists claim here, and then have a few sentences talking about their main arguments, what their main arguments are. And we're going to talk a little bit later about this Jennifer Doudna, and is she really the person that should be being cited here? Because this was done by a group of researchers, of scientists, and is she the real principal, or was it a group effort? And so, and the way to cite that. But to begin with here, there's the use of just the author's first name. And in an academic paper, you never want to use just the author's first name alone. You would use the last name. And in this case, because there are more than one author, you would use this construct here, the author's last name, the principal, and usually that's the first person cited. And again, usually that's done alphabetically by last name. So if there was an Anderson on this paper, Anderson would be the first person cited, and so Anderson's name would go here. And because I think there are something like 18 authors with this particular article, you don't want to list all of those authors out. And so you do this: you say Doudna, comma, et al, period, comma, and et al stands for and others. And you cite something this way if there were more than 3 authors to the article. And so you would just want to introduce it that way. And so here you have the thesis or the claim that the student is now making. So Doudna et al.'s overuse of sound reasoning and supportive evidence was strong, yet she was not as effective in her use of ethos. This created a lack of personal connection with her audience. And so a couple things I want to point out here is that just the verb tenses that we're using. When you're writing about a literary piece, you should use present tense verbs. And so you would want to use something like, and supportive evidence are strong, something like that. Here is, just 1 minute, here is an unneeded comma right here. So, and then coming here, this semicolon should actually be a comma. And so this now becomes a compound sentence. The semicolon is used when there are two sentences that are very closely linked. You can use a semicolon between them, two independent clauses that are closely linked. You can use a semicolon, but this isn't one of those cases. Yet she was not as effective in her use of ethos. Then right here, this is a comma splice. And a comma splice is a run-on sentence. And so what you have is, before that comma is a complete sentence. It has a subject, it has a verb. All of that is a complete sentence. And then you have another complete sentence right here. And so, there are a couple ways that you can fix this. If you put an and right here, that would fix it. I don't necessarily think that's the best way to do that, but personally I would do something like this, which creates a lack of personal connection with her audience. Here you have her, but it should be their audience because this is a group of people, not an individual that has written that. So that's one thing to look for is run-on sentences. We'll talk about sentence fragments a little bit later. Then we come down here, and you don't want to use the name of the article too often. This is fine right here, but you don't want to excessively bring up that article. You're mainly going to be using the author, the author's credentials instead of the name of the article. The one thing I would suggest with this is a capitalization like this, and that is this article itself was written for a science magazine, which will use APA formatting. We're using MLA formatting, and so the way it was correct as far as APA formatting, but because we're using MLA, you would want to use this capitalization for the article name. And so this is the summary of the article. For the most part, I think there's some good information in here. However, you need to make certain that in the summary, because of the nature of this paper, this is a summary. This is an analysis. The paper is an analysis of how well the author makes the arguments, and so the summary should be a summary of the author's arguments, and that's different sometimes from what is being presented. For example, talking about how the authors present new possibilities about altering diseases is separate from the arguments they make that there needs to be more transparency in the field around that. And so the summary should summarize their arguments not necessarily the evidence of the arguments or cool things about the technology, but the arguments that the authors are making. And so that's one thing you'll want to look for in your summary. As we go down further, I've added in just a section title. With this, this will help orient your reader to know, okay, now we're moving on to a new section. You don't have to use section titles, but I highly recommend it for that simple reason that it tells the reader, we're beginning a new section right here, and this is what it's about. Getting down into this, it's talking about the writer here again brings up that 18 authors worked on this, and it keeps bringing it up a few times in the paper, and it almost sounds like the author's trying to prove Doudna and her associates trying to prove that they're correct. That's not the purpose of this paper. Instead, you're supposed to be analyzing how well the author makes their arguments. And so that's what you kind of need to be looking for. And with that, going down a little bit further, just the pronouns that are being used, instead of her, where this is a group, you would need to say Doudna et al. Or their when you're talking about the group, because it is a group effort. It wasn't simply one author. There are a few other things here that are kind of specific to this paper. For example, removing the endnote references from the quotes. Those are going to affect the reader and not really be helpful to the reader. For example, I can click on that and it brings up just the article. And so that's generally not necessarily helpful to the reader, and so I would remove those from there. I'm going down here a little bit further, and I had marked it up in here, but you can't see that from my other markings up there. But MLA calls for a page number here, not the year of the publication. And so you would want to use a page number here. For something that's online that doesn't have page numbers, check MLA of how you should reference that if it's just the author's name. One thing I would suggest in every sentence as you're revising is to find ways to condense and pull out extra words that don't need to be there. For example, let's look at this sentence together. She continues forward with evidence that supports its ability to treat current diseases and reports. You could use something like, she provides evidence that supports, you know, it isn't clear, this technology's abilities to treat diseases. And you can pull out end reports here. And then, you know, we haven't substantially changed what this sentence says, but we've made it much more compact and easier to read. With that, I changed a comma that was here to a semicolon, or to a colon, I mean. And the reason for that is when you're introducing a quote, if this entire thing is its own sentence, and the quote is its own sentence or more than a sentence, that's the best way to introduce that, is with a colon. And we'll go through and show several other ways to punctuate around a quote. And down here, here's another example of somewhere you could change that to a colon. As we go down, and you can scroll through this paper. I'm going to post it online, like I said. Scroll down. We're not going to read this entire paragraph. But parts of this paragraph, it feels like the writer is trying to convince us of the rightness of the author's arguments, rather than analyzing how well the author made the arguments. And so that's something to watch for, is, am I trying to prove the author right or wrong, or am I analyzing how the arguments are made? They can be wrong, but still show logic in their arguments. They can be completely right, but have fallacies in their arguments where it isn't argued correctly. And so you need to be able to separate the difference between those two. Going down, there are a few other things, a sentence here that can be clarified. Pronoun usage, where we're using she when it's a group of authors. Here implies, that may not be the right word for that. Imply would mean that she knows she's making a fallacy and wants to make a fallacy, and so that might not be the correct word. A few other correct words. Here, this paragraph, and again, this is where headings would be helpful, because I don't know exactly what we've moved into here, but it seems to be talking somewhat about fallacies, and then it's also talking about assumptions, though. And so I'm left unsure of exactly what's being argued here. And so I think the author needs to clear that up, not talk about both assumptions and fallacies in the same paragraph. It says that this is a clear assumption of the unlimited potential of genome engineering, which is only comprehensible to those in this field of study. And so, this is where you ask yourself, who is this writer's audience? Is it people like me, or people in her own field? And so she's going to have different assumptions and make different arguments to people who don't understand genome theory and those who do. And so the assumption that she's making is that they do understand, and so those are the arguments she's using. She would use different arguments to convince somebody not in the field, say a congressman, to create a bill for greater transparency. She would use different arguments, different language for that. And so that's something that it's important to understand and know who her audience is when you're talking about a fallacy, when you're talking about assumptions of the author. The assumptions that the author is making is that my audience is this audience, and so this is how I'm portraying my arguments to them. And those can be false assumptions as well. And so, I asked down here, is this paragraph about fallacies or is it about assumptions? And so that's something important to add in. Going down, there are a couple of different quotes here that the writer's trying to tie together without much text between them. And sometimes that can work. In this situation, it's not working well. And so, for example, you have this original quote here, which is a complete sentence in and of itself, and then the author tried to just add this in to tie in another quote of several sentences. That's going to confuse your reader, and so the way to handle this is to have that original quote between here, have some kind of analysis, and then something that introduces the second quote. And that way your reader, is able to follow, is able to understand how these quotes relate to one another and why they're being used where they're being used. And here are just a few examples of how to condense some things. As we go down further, again, it feels like the writer's trying to prove that the authors of this paper, of the article, are right, rather than showing how they use ethos effectively, and so, or ineffectively. And so that's one thing to make certain is we're not trying to prove the author correct or incorrect. We're trying to prove whether or not they used arguments effectively. Here is an example of a quote first that would be that you would use a comma to introduce. She begins by stating, and so that is, this is not a complete sentence here, but what follows is, and so you use a comma. You begin this quote with a capital letter, but then it goes on into something else. And so this in the original material, obviously it didn't have this quote around it in the article itself, or this quote, but the authors did include quotes here. And so when this is set up in a paper where you're quoting and there's a quote within that quote, the correct way to do that is to do single quotes like this, and that lets the reader know that the article author was quoting something else. So that's the correct way to do that. Going down a little bit further, there's a sentence fragment here that's a little bit it's a little bit confusing, that a comma splice here, and so those are just things to make certain of, that each sentence is clear, that it's only one sentence, that if you're linking sentences together, you're doing so correctly. Now down here, and I'll have to show you the original way that this was written so that you can see. So if we go back to the original, and if so, under what circumstances, then there's some a key point of this discussion is whether the treatment or cure of severe diseases in humans would be a responsible use of genome engineering. Following it up with, and so I'm assuming that in the original text, these different quotes are separated by some text, and so the best way to fix that is to add some ellipses. And so if you go back to my marked up copy here, I've changed the way this is introduced because this is a sentence, and this is an ethical appeal. So I do a comma here because what follows is also is another independent clause, and so I'm linking two sentences together, and then I put an ellipses in here to show that there's some text that has been removed, but it's not critical to understanding what we're talking about, and it doesn't take the writer out of context. And so I can do that to connect two different quotations. And then I would just want to include the page number here. If they're on different pages, then I would just put a comma between the different page numbers. Again, we have kind of an argument for the author instead of an analysis of how well something's being done. Then we're getting down now into the conclusion of the paper. Again, we have this sentence that seems to show that the author is correct rather than an analysis of how well the author does. And this last sentence is pretty good. While her ethos did not have a significant appeal to the audience, her logos and pathos provided enough factual evidence for the reader to support her call to action on this topic. That's a fine conclusion. One thing I would point out is in the paper, it wasn't clear to me where the writer was talking about pathos, talking about emotional appeals. And so that's something to make certain you have all of those portions in your paper to show those appeals and what's being done. Moving down into the works cited, and this is something that I wanted to show you. Again, there are 14 authors in this for this paper, and so they're all of these authors. Jennifer Doudna isn't even on the first line of those authors, and so my first question to the writer would be, why is she listed as the principal writer? And there can be a few reasons. If she's the one who did all of the research and everybody else was her research assistants, then of course she's the principal author. And as a courtesy, she's just listed the other people with her. If this truly was a group effort, then usually, like I said, these names are listed alphabetically by last name. And so the correct way to cite this would be to simply do this. And a comma is needed between the last name and the first name. If Jennifer Doudna is the principal author, though, her name, of course, would be the one that would be there, and then the et al. And so then going back again, we would, for the title of the article, we would use MLA formatting requirements here, list all of the other information about the magazine and everything else there, and everything else here looks correct. Again, I hope this has been helpful to you. If you have questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. Email me, text me, call me on my phone after 5 o'clock Mountain Time on weekdays. I'm more than happy to help out however I can. All right, thank you and good luck on your papers.